Seems like I can't stay in one place for too long. This week for me has been all about subsurface scattering. A couple videos ago, I posted my first process overview video where I created this plant from scratch. While I'm very happy with how the render came out, it's still missing one important thing. Leaves have this really cool property where if you hold them up to the light, you can see this translucency to them. This is a property of subsurface scattering where the light enters an object, then it bounces around and some of it escapes. In a way, all objects do this, but some have properties that give it a sort of translucent or glowing effect. Things like skin or wax, or most importantly for today, leaves. Also, fun fact, the difference between transparency and translucency is a transparent material allows all of the light to shine through it, such as glass, but a translucent material only allows some light to pass through it. Today, we're going to use Substance Painter and Redshift to apply the subsurface scattering effect to a leaf. The first thing we need to do is determine where on the leaf this scattering effect is going to take place. This requires a mask in the form of a scattering map. We can generate this mask using some procedural features in Substance Painter, and then also add some custom hand-painted elements in more detail. So right now you can see, here's another leaf that I made, using the same process that I did in my process overview video. Right now it has all of the base color, reflection, normal, height, and displacement stuff that we used before, but now we need to add subsurface scattering to it. In order to view subsurface scattering in Substance Painter, we need to make sure that everything is enabled. So the first thing we need to do is go to our display and also our shader settings and turn on subsurface scattering. So let's go over here to the screen with the gear in it. This is our display settings. And we're going to scroll down and find activate subsurface scattering. Kind of click that, and I'm going to make my sample count somewhere around 50. So 51's fine here. Now let's go down to the globe with the gear, and this is our shader settings. You notice we have this area dedicated to subsurface scattering. Make sure it's enabled, and we're going to use skin as the scattering type, and I'm going to change the color to sort of a light green color. And we're going to keep the scale where it is for now. We only have one texture set here, so I'm going to go to my texture set settings, and I'm going to scroll down to where this plus is in the channels, click the plus, and choose scattering. You'll see it's been added here. This gives us a specific channel to paint on. The scattering map is going to be black and white, and we're going to paint those colors to tell Redshift where and where not to use this effect. This channel will tell Substance Painter what to export into the scattering map image file that we're going to generate later. The next thing we need to do is bake our mesh maps. Now, what do I mean by that? Substance Painter allows you to create maps that give the program more of an idea of what is happening with the geometry that you have imported in. Things like world position, where things are in space, curvature on the surface, and thickness. We're going to use the thickness map today. So to bake our mesh maps, we're going to go back to our texture set settings. So we're going to scroll down a little bit to where it says mesh maps, and we're going to say bake mesh maps. So I'm going to keep the output size at 2K, and let's go ahead and create a normal, world space normal. We'll untick ID because we don't need that. Ambient occlusion's good, curvature, position, and the important one for this tutorial is thickness. So go ahead and hit Bake Default Mesh Maps. Okay, now that it's done, we'll hit OK, and go back to our Layers tab. So let's create a new fill layer. And I'm going to Alt-click on this new scattering channel that's available so that we only have that one selected. Then where it says scattering right here, I'm going to click on it, and then I'm going to put in project. These are all the mesh maps that we just baked under the project that we're currently working on. And I'm going to choose the thickness map that we just created, and that's what it looks like. So I'm going to click on that, and if I go over to where it says material and down to scattering, this is what our scattering map looks like so far. And this is the procedural part of this whole process. We've used that thickness map to create a scattering map. And if we go into our material view and we go back to our shader settings, we can increase the scale, and you can see, if you look around here, you can see the subsurface starting to work, and I can rotate the light a little bit, and you can see we're starting to get that inner glow that I'm talking about. So I'm going to keep the scale right around here. And next what I want to do is take some of the maps and masks that I've used previously and apply them to this scattering map as well. So I'm going to rename this. Then I'm going to create a new fill layer, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to alt-click on scattering, and I'm going to make sure that this scattering is set down to 0. Our original scattering was set to this thickness map. This particular fill layer, the scattering is going to be at 0. And that's because I'm now going to paint in and also copy some of my previous masks in this project to determine where I don't want scattering to happen. So with our scattering set to 0 here on this new fill layer, I'm going to go back into my vein lines folder that I've created here. And you can see I have a couple layers here. So here's my vein lines thin. I'm going to click on that. In fact, I'm going to alt-click on the mask, and I want you to see what this is comprised of. Where it is white is where I've manually painted in where the veins are for my leaf. And I also don't want any subsurface scattering here because it's a bit thicker here in this part of the leaf. So I'm going to right-click on the mask and choose Copy Mask. I'm then going to go up to our new fill layer, and I'm going to add a black mask. Then I'm going to right-click on it and choose Paste into Mask. Now, because our fill layer here, if I click on that, because our scattering is set to 0, everything that we have here that's shining through our black mask is going to show up as taking away the subsurface scattering because it's set to 0. So let's see what I mean by that. If I click Material and I want to view my scattering mask, you can see that everywhere that was white in this mask is now applying the value that we've set on our fill layer, which is 0. So for instance, if I drag this up, you see now it's applying the value that we set to that fill layer. So I want to apply a 0 value. Now, if I click back into my mask, I want to add a paint layer. So going to the magic wand and choosing Add Paint. Now I'm going to choose this dirt brush. And if I go into my brush settings, you can either look at them here or you can right click and it'll pop up. I'm going to adjust the jitter and flow of this particular brush. I'm going to minimize the flow a little bit. And this is based on the pressure sensitivity of my tablet. And I'm going to go down to jitter, and I'm going to increase the size jitter. And I'm currently painting white, but if I press X on my keyboard, I'm now painting black on the mask. This might seem a bit confusing. So if I alt-click on the mask, this is the mask that we're creating, and I tap on my paint layer. Even though I'm painting white on this mask, when I go back to my scattering map, it's going to look black because this is where we don't want any scattering to come through. So right now, because I want to see everything that I'm doing on my scattering channel, I'm going to be on the scattering view, and I'm going to increase the size. And really what I want to do is just add some variation to this scattering. So I'm going to lightly paint around, and I'm going to hit X to switch and take away some stuff, and I can press X to remove and just add that variation here that I'm doing, adding sort of a realistic look to it. Making sure not to get rid of those stem lines too much. Just adding some manual variation to what's going on here. And to make sure I'm not covering up those veins too much, I'm selecting the paint layer that we were just on, and I'm going to the opacity slider, and I'm just going to drag it down a little. You can see what this layer is doing, and I want to make sure those veins are really prevalent here. Excellent. So we can get sort of an example of what's going on in Substance Painter by going back to our material view and shift and right clicking, and you can move the light around. And if you really want to get an idea of what's happening with your subsurface scattering, you can go to the shader settings and then play with the scale a little bit and see what it's doing. You can also adjust the color. So maybe I want to make this a bit more yellow. Remember when I mentioned earlier about that scattering channel we added in our texture set settings? Well, here's where it becomes useful. So I'm going to go to File, Export Textures. I'm going to pick a location, and I'm going to go to my output templates. I'm going to choose the PBR metallic roughness because that's what I've been doing before. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a gray map here, and I'm going to rename this scattering. And then Substance Painter lists all of the input maps and mesh maps, all of the maps that it creates right here on this right side of the panel. And so I'm going to go to that scattering channel that we created, and I'm going to drag it onto this GR square here and let go, and I'm going to choose gray channel. So that means it's going to take the scattering channel that we created and export it into this PNG. So right now I'm just doing this on this global settings area right here, and I'm going to go back to my output templates, and I'm going to make sure that my scattering channel is 16 bits. I just want to include all the information I have. So if I go to my list of exports, you should see that this scattering.png is there. If not, go to settings and hit this reset button. I've noticed that sometimes my exports don't list everything that I need. So go ahead, make sure you hit reset, pick a directory, and add that scattering channel in, and now you're ready to go. So now that I'm here, I'm going to go to my list of exports, everything's here, and I'm going to choose export. Okay, everything's done, so I'm going to close out of this window, and we're going to head into Cinema 4D and Redshift. Okay, so we're in Cinema 4D, and I've imported my leaf here. So let's set the scene up a little bit. So I'm going to add a dome light here with an HDRI so we can sort of see what's going on with the reflections and the overall lighting and bounces and everything. So we're going to go into Redshift here and go to Lights, choose Dome Light. And I'm just going to add the HDRI that I use for pretty much everything. So that's looking good. Next, I'm going to go to my leaf, and I'm going to right-click, go to Redshift, and choose Redshift Object. And I'm going to go to the Geometry tab, choose Override, and enable Tessellation and Displacement. And because this scene is extremely small, because you want to keep things pretty much physically accurate in terms of size when it comes to subsurface scattering, these numbers are going to be extremely small as well. So to demonstrate just how small this is, I'm going to import a default cube here. And this is 200 centimeters. And you can see we are much, much smaller than that. So let me remove my cube, go back into the object tag, and I'm just going to add in some small numbers here that I know are going to work for me, but you can play with these later. Okay, now that that's set up, let's create our material. So I'm going to go to Create, Redshift, Materials, and I'm going to create the Subsurface Scattering Material Shader that comes with Redshift. And I'm going to drag that right onto my leaf. Now, not much is happening. You can see we got some reflections going on here, but because this object is so small, we need to make some immediate changes. So I'm going to double click on my material to bring up the material graph, and let's just move over here, and I'm going to select this Redshift SSS or Subsurface Scattering node, and I'm going to go to the Diffuse and Subsurface Scattering Layers tab, go down to Scatter Radius, and I'm just going to bring it down, and watch what happens as I bring it down. You'll see we're starting to get some light shining through here. We really need to bring it down to something really small in order to really get a good result going on here. So now you can see that we are getting light shining through this leaf here, and we can adjust these values later on. So here are the maps that Substance Painter exported. Let's start by adding in our base color, just dragging it into the graph here. So I'm going to take the output color output, and I'm going to bring it into my Redshift Subsurface Scattering Shader node, and I'm going to bring it into where it says Diffuse and Subsurface Scattering Layers, Subsurface. I'm going to choose the Subsurface color. And you can see we now have our color that we painted in Substance Painter. Next, let's add a bump map to this. So we're going to our leaf textures, and I'm going to drag in our normal map here. And I'm going to go to Find Nodes and type in bump, drag in a bump map node, and bring the out of this texture into the texture input of this bump map node. And now I'm going to drag this output into our bump mapping bump input. And so you can see now in our leaf, we're starting to get some of that normal information, and we can adjust the height scale to get our desired result here. Okay, next up, let's add our roughness. Found the roughness map here, let's drag it in. So the Redshift Subsurface Scattering Shader uses a glossy form of roughness instead of the regular roughness that we're using in our physically based metal roughness template. So we just need to invert this texture to convert it from a roughness map to a glossy map. So we can type in invert, and I'm going to choose this green invert. I want to show you what's going on here. So to do that, what I'm going to do is first, I'm going to put this output color and replace our base color with this roughness in our subsurface color input so that we can see what's going on here on this mask. And right now you can't see very much of what's going on, but if you look, you can see we've got all that little intricate detail here going on, and we're going to pump this into the invert, and I'm going to show you this node is inverting that. But in the process of doing that, it kind of doesn't do it one-to-one. You need to sort of focus it in. So to do that, I'm going to go and search for another node, and that is the color correct node. So let's drag a color correct in. Let's pump this into the input from our Redshift invert node, and let's bring the output of this into our subsurface color so we can see what we're doing here. And if I click on this node and go to the properties, I'm going to adjust the gamma and the contrast. Bring the gamma really far down here. And now you can start to see this mask a bit more. So if we play with these values a little bit, so right now, these are the settings that I'm going to go for, and you can see we've got all kinds of random roughness information going on here. So now I'm going to reconnect my base color to the subsurface scatter color, and now I'm going to connect the Redshift color correct node that's connected to our roughness and our invert, and I'm going to go to reflections and reflections gloss. Now if I go to the subsurface scatter node and go to reflections, I can change the weight of the general reflectivity of this shader. And if I bring it up, you can start to see we're getting some of that random roughness and specular values that we were using in that mask. So I'm just going to clean up my graph a little more because the window size is a bit small. And now it's time to add our height map. So I'm going to drag it in here. We're going to use displacement, which is why we set up that object tag on our leaf. So I'm going to type in displacement here. Drag in a displacement node, and from the texture I'm going to bring it into the texture text map input, and then pump the displacement node into our output node and displacement. So this isn't the Redshift shader node, this is the output node. And so now you can start to see we're getting some of that nice displacement in our leaf from our height map. Right now, things are looking pretty good, but we did create a specific map for a subsurface scattering, and so now we're going to import that into our shader graph to really fine-tune where on this surface the subsurface scattering light is shining through. Here's our scattering map that we exported, so I'm going to drag that in, and we're going to do a similar thing that we did with the roughness map. Because the way Redshift works, instead of saying, here's where the scattering is going to occur, we're going to say, here's where the diffuse color is going to come in, and everywhere else is going to be where the subsurface scattering is coming in. And this will make more sense in a second. If you go to this Redshift subsurface scattering node, and you go to the diffuse and subsurface scattering layers tab, you can choose how much diffuse shows through versus where the scattering shines through. So if we drag the diffuse amount and we bring it all the way up, this is what our leaf looks like with no scattering. And we can walk it back and get this universal subsurface everywhere we look, and that could be just fine for what you're doing. But we're going to drive this diffuse amount by our scattering mask, and to do that we need to invert it the same way we did our roughness map. So let's again add an invert and drag it in, and here we go. We plugged our texture into our invert node, and to see what's going on, just like before, I'm going to drag this output from our invert and I'm going to put it into our subsurface color just to see what's going on. Right now you can't see very much, so what we're going to do is get that color correct and drag that in and pump that into our color. In the properties, I'm going to bring down the gamma, increase the contrast, and as I increase the gamma and the contrast and adjust these parameters, you can see where it is white here, and that's where we're not going to have any subsurface. So let me just dial in to make sure all of my values are where I want them to be. And really what I want to do is just add a bit of variation here. Add a little bit of subsurface in by decreasing the contrast. And now we can plug back in our color into the subsurface color, and we're going to take our scattering map and bring this in. And really what it is the diffuse amount. So let's put that in there. And it might not be obvious as to what's going on here, but let's rotate a little bit. I'm going to go to the Redshift menu, lights, and I'm going to get an area light. And because our scene is so small, I need to scale it down. And I'm going to rotate this light 90 degrees and move it down. And let's adjust the properties of this light because it's a bit too bright. And so now, if I have this light shine through the leaf, so if I turn off the dome light here and let this resolve a little bit, you can see that the light is shining through the leaf except for where our veins are and where we defined in our subsurface scattering map that we inverted to create this sort of diffuse amount map in Redshift. And this gives off the effect that the leaf is thicker in certain parts, like where the veins are in this instance. So now if we turn everything back on, I can leave the light there just to see what's going on. This is what we're getting with our leaf texture. Now we have a much more organic looking leaf with light shining through this translucent-like material. Using subsurface scattering, we are able to enhance the realism of our materials. Redshift makes it really easy with its built-in shader, but other render engines do the same. With Substance Painter, we can pick and choose where we want this effect to take place. The more control you have, the more you get to be an artist. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below. I understand that a lot of what was going on in this video might not make sense until the end, so it might be worth another watch just to let it sink in. If you found this video helpful, please leave a thumbs up, and if you want to see more texture tutorials from me, subscribe to my channel and hit the bell to be notified when I post new videos. Until next time, thanks for watching.